So, hello, Ashlen, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today about your life, your studies, and your cult intervention work. Would
Hi,
you like to
Casey.
start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Of course. I'm so excited to be here. I've absolutely loved connecting with you in the past, and thank you for being okay with my rescheduled dates. Life has been a little crazy. Yeah, my name is Ashlen Hilliard. I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm enjoying life in the Pacific Northwest. I run my own LLC, and I have a blind dog. His name is Hamilton, and an orange cat named Ferguson. That's my life at a glimpse. I am very happy to be here and to get into whatever you want to talk about.
I think we might have got a little sneak peek at Hamilton the last time we spoke,
Oh,
which
you may have.
yeah,
Yes.
which wasn't
Yes.
recorded, but that's when I asked if you'd come and chat with me about your experiences on the Salford Master's course, The
Mm-hmm.
Psychology of Coercive Control, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But as we usually do with these interviews or conversations, as I like to call them, is we paint a chronology of some type. So you grew up in the Churches of Christ, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So I'm trying to think how to explain this in a concise way because I grew up in a military family. And so my dad was in the US Air Force. We moved every few years. And so I think that provided a really sort of challenging childhood, but also one that immersed me in different churches of Christ across the US, different cultural settings. I think it provided me a challenging opportunity for growth. So I wasn't just in one church of Christ all my life. And I think that that's a good thing. I've seen many different churches of Christ all across the US because of the upbringing that I had. So it's really helped inform my perspectives. But long story short, I was born in Florida. We even moved to the UK for a few years when I was very young. I started school in the UK, actually at a school. It was called Hockwald Primary School. And my US friends would be like, it sounds like Hogwarts. No, it's Hockwald Primary School. My teacher's name was Mrs. Linthicum. It was just very, very British. It was a good time. I had a little British accent. And then we were stationed in Texas. So we moved to Texas, and I lost that British accent very quickly, as you can imagine, moving to Texas. And we're there for 4 years and then moved to Utah. And I say that I'm from Utah because I was in Utah from fourth grade onward. And so Utah was home for me. There was different churches of Christ that we attended in Utah. So even in Utah, it wasn't just one church there, but to give some perspective, churches of Christ, they're normally Bible Belt centered. It's typically a Southern Christian fundamentalist. That's where they're most commonly found. In a place like Utah in the West, there was only like 3 churches of Christ in the whole state that were seen as part of the churches of Christ. I'm doing air quotes for those of you who can't see me. And, some of those were even more liberal than other conservative churches of Christ because it was just so separated from the Bible Belt and that culture. And what was really interesting was the people who made up those churches were mostly military families. Like my family, my mom was from Florida. Some of you may consider it the South, others of you may not, but still a very conservative state. She was a part of this church. We had multi-generational involvement on my mom's side. And so her and my dad, of course, whenever they were stationed, even in the UK, in Texas, they were attending a Church of Christ, whether that took half an hour to drive to or, 15 minutes, we would attend a Church of Christ. And it was mostly made up by military families who also were a part of that church. So I found it really interesting that that was sort of the subculture, if that makes sense.
That is really interesting. And you have answered so many of the following questions that I was going to ask around, whether you had access to a Church of Christ building or community in the UK, because I don't think that's a religious group that I've come across in my part of the UK, which is Liverpool. I don't know if you were in the north or south.
And I was so young, I honestly have no idea any of those details. I know that we lived in Lakenheath when we were stationed there. And
Okay.
yeah, so I know it was Lakenheath. My mom has talked to me about how they found a church. And it was a 1-cup church is what it's lovingly called, so during communion, everyone shares the sort of 1 cup for that part of the service, but it was a 1-cup church. So there's things different that probably fit more so UK culture than like US culture than that church. I thought it was interesting how even overseas, that sort of makeup of the church and those conservative worldviews weren't that different than like churches in the US.
The military, as I understand it, in America as well, they have their own laws around things like infidelity. I don't know if that still applies, but some of the things that I've read from previous memoirs, like Daniela Mestyanek-Young's memoir Uncultured, she talks a little bit about this subject. So do you feel like the military have to think about the religious group that your family affiliate themselves with when they're looking at placements to send your father where the family would follow?
It's interesting you bring that up about infidelity. I had not heard of that. That doesn't mean that doesn't happen, but to my knowledge, within the Air Force, I have no idea if that's a thing or still a thing. I find that really like shocking and interesting, actually. When it came to my dad's assignments, I don't think they took into consideration, where a Church of Christ was. It was just, this is your assignment. From what I understood, it was, here's your assignment. And then from there, I mean, in Texas, we had no trouble because, Texas, there's a lot of Churches of Christ. And for a while in Texas, we separated from a larger Church of Christ there and actually like had our own home church situation. We like kind of started our own Church of Christ with another family who was really disheartened by the actions of the church there. And so I've even had that experience of meeting with a few families in our home until money was saved up for a building. So even having that behind the scenes. But as far as like where we lived, I imagine the most challenging place when it came to a Church of Christ to live was actually in Utah, was because it is such a Mormon dominated culture. There were so few Churches of Christ, and one that we attended was considered, much more liberal. There was almost a question mark there as like whether that would be considered like a true Church of Christ, if that makes sense. And I'd be happy to go into that, later on. But
I just quickly had a look here about adultery within the
yes, tell me. I'm so interested.
It comes down to conduct under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is a separate set of rules from federal and state laws. So adultery underneath the UCMJ is illegal in the military, and it's to do with how your behavior reflects on the armed forces as a whole within your time spent employed within the armed forces, if that helps to answer our question.
I just find that so interesting. There's been conversations surrounding the military, and when it comes to like boot camp and ideology and community driven and that sort of level of intensity as maybe having some, aspects of like almost like cult dynamics or things like that. So that has been kind of a conversation within the field, and a very interesting conversation. But I think too, we were really structured, whether it was because of that military family influence but then with that added dynamic of church involvement, we were very, very structured. Things were black and white. This is right. This is wrong. So it provided a very interesting, I guess, environment to grow up in. Those two confluences of things.
We've definitely covered the armed forces, or we've spoken about the Royal Marines. We've spoken about the United States Marine Corps on the show before in terms of high demand dynamics, which are certainly a part of the Marines. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So we've spoken about that, not in an anti-military way, but just in a perhaps some of these methods are being adopted by other groups that do go on to create destructive cults. So that's been some interesting insights. And I wonder your almost unique insight into the Churches of Christ because of the various different churches that you attended in different parts of the world. Are you able to draw absolute similarities and replicated system across the different churches that you went to?
Absolutely. It's very interesting you say that because, like I mentioned, I am grateful that I did experience many different churches of Christ. It's, it really shed a lot of perspective my sibling, he mostly grew up, because of the age difference, he mostly grew up attending like one church in Utah for most of his life. And his experiences within the church were so different than my experiences within the church, because I've seen more conservative, extreme versions of it, less extreme versions of it, more liberal versions, not so liberal. I've kind of seen everything in between. But what's really interesting about this group and the conversations that I've brought into the cult recovery field about this group is that, when you think of a high control group or a fundamentalist set of churches, conservative churches, when we talk about this in the cultic studies sphere, we assume that that means that there's like one leader at the helm, or that there is like a very denominational structure of like authoritative figures. We think of the Catholic Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, even certain Baptist organizations. There is like some sort of authority structure, organizational leadership, and there is not that at all within the churches of Christ. They are all independently run, non-denominational churches. So what's so interesting about that is if you go to a Church of Christ in Texas, for example, the money that's donated on Sunday stays within the confines of the church. The preacher there doesn't report to an external board of pastors or preachers or anything like that. Each church has their own set of elders, deacons, and that's how they run things. But if you go to a Church of Christ, let's say in Texas, and then you go to a Church of Christ in Florida, what you notice is the patterns of the church worship, even when it comes down to the language of how things are said, even, when we think of like communion and, singing, the structure of the church sort of program is almost exactly the same. And it's really interesting for a non-denominational church to have that sort of pattern similarity when it's not denominationally run. And so there's kind of this joke that the Church of Christ is a non-denominational denomination, that claims to be non-denominational, but every Church of Christ that you go to, you feel like you're almost walking into the same building, the same characters are there, the same things being spoken of. And what holds the churches of Christ together is its theology, and it's more specifically its hermeneutical methodology, which is the way in which the scriptures are interpreted. So instead of having any sort of like leader or cult leader, what we're talking about is a controlling theological mechanism that informs the patterns and practices of local churches of Christ. And that could be seen across the country, even in different parts of the world. It's fascinating. And there's not been a lot of attention to, churches that, it's just a local church down the street, for example. And so I've tried to bring about more conversations and awareness to this within the cult recovery field. Like cults don't have to, cults can be leaderless. Destructive groups don't need to have a leader. And there is a role that controlling theology can play when it comes to informing cultural practices and theological beliefs and local church systems, such as the Churches of Christ. It's really fascinating.
It really is interesting, because I'm trying to think of other examples, and usually this is the part where I'd go, oh, that sounds like this, but actually I'm thinking about all of the things that don't sound like that. Every church in the Churches of Christ is different. The only thing that is the same throughout is the way that the text is interpreted.
You got it. That's it.
Oh my goodness. I mean, even the children of God, if you think about the way that was replicated from country to country, in the way that they could just pluck families out of one country and move them to another, you wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't have this system that was well refined, like a well-oiled machine that worked in the way that it did. But that's almost the opposite of what we're talking about here, which is so fascinating.
Is your mind blowing? I love to see like you taking in this information. It almost seems like your mind is just like exploded, which is really cool for me, because I really think that this is an important area to talk about, and it's just not talked about. Within the field of cultic studies, we can be so focused on like, oh, this group is bad because it has, a cult leader and da 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 da. And while that is so often the theme, and I'm not trying to discredit that, oh my goodness, cult leaders are awful and abusive, there are so many ways in which coercive control can manifest within religious groups, local churches, family systems, it really can open up our perspectives to how that can work and what that may look like.
I just can't believe that so many groups exist around the Churches of Christ when there isn't a step-by-step guide on how the hierarchy or leadership should implement a new church, and how then members of that church will be coached to move out and create their own.
Well, there actually kind of is. There actually kind of is. I'm happy if it's a good time, I'm happy to talk about the historical aspect of this, because it really informs the modern day Churches of Christ and why they function like they do. And if you look back in the history, we were always told growing up that we were the first century churches operating within the 21st century. So in other words, within the New Testament, you read about churches that were under severe persecution. Paul's letters write about this a lot. And it was within the text of the scripture, I believe it was the writings of Paul, where Paul talks about the Churches of Christ in his letters. And so that's where the term Churches of Christ comes from, is a very literal line within the biblical text. And so it's really interesting in that, we were told growing up that we are the first century churches within the 21st century existing. Again, it's like that prison of specialness. I know Pat Ryan talks about this a lot. We were told that we were the church that can be traced back to the New Testament that we're operating. But in reality, when you look at the historical perspectives, the Churches of Christ movement within the United States was informed largely by the Anabaptist movement and beliefs over in Europe. And it was led and sort of created by Thomas Campbell and Barton W. Stone during the Second Great Awakening within the U.S. So we're looking at a time of extreme religious upheaval. This was also the time where Joseph Smith and Mormonism came to the scene. All of these sort of characters, this was all happening simultaneously. As far as what I understand, even about Jehovah's Witnesses history, it comes from that same time period as well. So many of our movements within the US and breakoffs come from the Second Great Awakening. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about the Second Great Awakening. People were looking at the West as this sort of beautiful frontier. Sadly, there was a lot of colonialism that was happening. People back then felt like they were able to come in and had the right to conquer and explore the West and take what was theirs. And we all know US history from that point on. But what was really interesting about Campbell and Stone was they were largely influenced by Thomas Locke's Common Sense, the book Common Sense. And there was sort of this worldview back then that we're living and we're seeing all these different groups pop up. We see Joseph Smith, we see all these sort of figures. And what this sort of common sense perspective provided for these two men who were so influential in the group was that, why do we have all this division? They were basically like, why are people going off in all these different directions? Why all this division? And they sort of claimed to provide a solution to that. They argued that a solution could be provided, and it was Campbell who wrote a declaration and address, and it was basically this very long letter. You can look it up on even Wikipedia, I think would have it. And within this declaration and address, it was basically talking about, here are the ways, the scripture is meant to be interpreted really simply, free from the ideas of men. In other words, we should be able to interpret the scripture the same all the time. It should be very simply understood. And while I think their intentions were good in that they were trying to eliminate all the division that was happening at the time and all these different belief systems, what that has sort of trickled down and turned into is a certain theological interpretation of the scripture, a certain doctrinal, it's almost like a set of rules in interpreting the scripture, in which we're forced to look through this worldview. And of course, we're going to come out the other end saying we all believe the same on this, because we're supposed to take in this pattern of interpreting the Bible. And this hermeneutical methodology is called CINI, the CINI method, CENI, CINI. And it stands for Command, Example, and Necessary Inference. And those were our tools in sort of deciphering scripture in the Bible. The Churches of Christ can take the scripture very literally, and that comes out of the CINI methodology. CINI is, in my opinion, it can be a very self-defeating, in interpreting mechanism. It's hard because it really creates like this. If you use Cine, of course, we're going to all think the same on this, and so it fuels these ideas of group prejudices on different beliefs. But I think the most dangerous part about this use of Cine is if you don't agree with what Cine is telling you that you should agree on, that could mean that you're disrespecting the authority of God. That could mean that you're not saved, you're condemned to hell. And so it really eliminates, and what Thomas Campbell and Barton W. Stone wanted to eliminate is free thought, in order to maintain unity. And it's like, at what cost are we trying to maintain unity when we can't interpret? That's part of the beauty of like these old religious texts, is being able to interpret something in your own way. But when you don't interpret it the way that this set hermeneutical method wants you to interpret it as, that can be really dangerous for your soul.
Of course, there has to be hundreds of different ways to interpret this same text, as in the Bible, for example, because even if you talk about the Second Great Awakening and you consider William Miller and the Millerite movement, and then you think about Ellen G. White and Seventh-day Adventism that came from breaking away from the Millerite movement, which came from the Second Great Awakening, where William Miller was like, no, actually, I interpret this differently. Right. And then, of course, there's, I talk about this all the time. Seventh-day Adventists is like my staple go-to look at all these branches that have come from this one movement. So, of course, there has to be endless ways to interpret the text. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all these denominations of Christianity or any major religion.
And it's really interesting to see historically how Tom Locke's book Common Sense really fueled this sort of simplistic view of interpreting scripture. That was pretty amazing to me, that the historical context at that time was very much so like, well, we can't all agree on the scripture. We just have to interpret it very plainly and simply. And over time, it turned into a much more standardized, and I'm talking like throughout the generations, it's turned into a much more standardized thing. When you mentioned splits and branches, in the 1950s, the Churches of Christ saw one of the largest splits that they have basically ever encountered within the movement. There was this huge debate about whether a church should remain institutional or non-institutional. And non-institutional churches, that's what I came from, was the non-institutional branch. It is the much smaller branch of the Church of Christ. The institutional branch is a branch in which I would consider more liberal, much more like, almost denominationally, run, how some of the churches were run within the ICOC movement. It kind of rings more of institutional in my head. So anyways, there was this massive debate that happened amongst Churches of Christ leadership in the 1950s. And the debate was focused on a couple of things. And one of those is, should we give money to orphan homes? Should we send money outside of the church to orphan homes? Or, should we support preachers overseas? Or basically, a lot of it came down to, where should the money go? And should we have money within the church that goes to like instrumental worship, for example? I grew up in a church that was a cappella only all the time. There was no instruments of worship because they believed that was the biblical model. And they were very strict on other churches who did have instruments. That was just like such a big no. So with all these debates happening, I point this out because, my family has had generational involvement. My grandmother could probably recall some of these debates that were happening, back then during that time. It was such a wild time. It was truly like the Wild West was in the Churches of Christ. There was debates, there was lectures, all these different men from different congregations were writing about it. And what that sort of left us with was, I left the non-institutional branch of the Church of Christ. What that means is money does not get sent to orphan homes and things that scripture talks about donating to. Money stays within the congregation. They do think it is the individual's responsibility to give, if you want to give to a nonprofit or all that's great. But as a church, we're not going to give to community programs. We're not going to do XYZ. It's going to stay within the church. And it was just pretty amazing because this strictness led to the church as being referred to as the antis. ANTI, the antis. Like, it's kind of funny because we were called the antis because we were anti everything. We were anti this, anti that. We were anti-donating money here, donating money there. And while that kind of seems like a funny thing, it was actually taken pretty seriously. I mean, there was letters written about, don't call us the antis. It was a very offensive term to some of the people within the church. But the dynamics, I mean, I was listening to a talk this morning before speaking with you, Casey, about a presentation I gave a few years ago about the history of the Churches of Christ. But there were some congregations that even went so far as, if you did not almost make a token donation to another church that was either non-institutional or not institutional, whatever you believed, you could have been fired because you, like, as being a preacher for that church, because you weren't aligning with, it was a very sort of cultic dynamic throughout history. There was physical fights that ensued within church buildings, like physical fights during this time in history. A lot of it was seen as status. Some people from the pulpit had to declare that they were affiliated as being non-institutional or not, or they could lose their jobs. And so it was a very intense time within the Churches of Christ. And within history, the non-institutional, when you think about when it comes to recruitment, who wants to kind of like join this group that's so intensely being called the antis? Like what appeal does that have for people? There was a college, and it's the college that I attended in Florida. It's called Florida College. And Florida College served as, basically, it used to be a Bible college solely. It's still a Bible college, but there's now more than just Bible degrees being offered. But Florida College served as a haven for young people who were being raised in non-institutional churches. We all came from the antis. And what was great about Florida College was you could go find your spouse there, who was also a part of the non-institutional church. It was a very, very small college. I'm talking a couple hundred students at the most. And we were sort of the outcasts, so to speak. We were the really strict ones. We came from all over the country. There was people at the college from Alaska. Some were from overseas, looking to connect with other Christians who were from this form of faith, so to speak. You find connection there. And what's really wild was the men who teach a lot of the Bible classes were some of the leaders in these debates in the 50s.
Wow.
And
okay.
So I was learning from the men who were leading sort of these debates and discussions, who wrote papers on it. I was, in those Bible classes every day. And man, was it an intense atmosphere of indoctrination, if there ever was one, learning from men who were just, and they still are, they're looked at as being so revered for their contributions to the churches over time. Several people, you'll get married, you'll find your spouse within the group. Sometimes the man will major in biblical studies, sometimes not. And at the young age of like 21, 22, a church across the US, a Church of Christ, will hire you because you went to Florida College. And that was seen as, the biggest win you could do. The most qualified thing that you could be a part of is going to Florida College and having that 4-year biblical studies diploma. It's really interesting because most pastors, most preachers and other churches, they have to have gone to seminary. They have to have gotten, a master's degree in a divinity or something. There's some sort of component to that. But with the Churches of Christ, a young man graduating with a young wife with that 4-year Bible diploma was enough. And a church will hire young men all across the US, usually very struggling churches, will hire these young men and bring them in and move them out. And going to Florida College was seen as like that's a big deal, and sort of preparing them and educating them about the church and learning the doctrine. And so it's very interesting.
It's kind of like the Brigham Young University for the Mormon faith.
It is.
And when you're talking about the conflict between the institutional and the non-institutional Churches of Christ, is almost like you can see that conflict with the LDS and the FLDS sects of Mormonism.
Absolutely. So it's very interesting. We're not all that different, even though we felt like we were in a prison of specialness. My grandmother used to work for the college. My mom went to the college. I went to the college. I was third generation and going to this college. And so my family was, well known within this particular church. And so it's pretty amazing. And that generational involvement, I wasn't the only one who was there who had that sort of generational involvement. So, we think of Mormons as, they do a lot of missionary work. They go and they recruit and they try to convert. I don't really see that with the Church of Christ. What I see mostly with the Church of Christ is people are born and raised within the Church of Christ, and they attend Florida College and they get married and you have children. And that is how the Church of Christ has been continuing. And so it's really interesting. Of course, they talk to people about Jesus. Of course, there's like this presumption that we should be talking to people about the church and about Christ, but not many people just join the Church of Christ. It's very like family, generationally driven. And most of us have had some sort of contact, if you're within the non-institutional church, with the college in Florida, which has kind of helped. I think the college in Florida, if that didn't exist, I don't know if this group would still be sustainable or going, if that makes sense. They've played such a huge role in sort of educating and producing the next generation of non-institutional churches of Christ, young college students.
It definitely does make sense. And actually what you've said about the money staying within the churches, because of the model that is used across the churches of Christ in terms of the theological aspects, are what makes that similarity from one church to the next. When you talk about Mormonism, or you talk about other mainstream branches of Christianity that exist across the world, the money is funneled up throughout the hierarchy. So it makes sense to convert adults who have paying jobs that can give tithe and can give a percentage of their income to the church to generate more properties, or to make leadership more wealthy, or whatever the intentions are behind collecting gross amounts of money from individuals at the lowest levels of the hierarchies within these high demand religious groups. But then if that doesn't exist in the churches of Christ, then the best way to convert is not to convert, but actually just grow families instead, so that you'll always have generations to go to the college.
It's very different in that regard. There wasn't really a focus. And in fact, when I was young, well, I'm still young, but younger, I loved doing evangelism. I mean, hell, I was out there doing street evangelism. I was like so awkwardly like confident about it. And that was, I feel like, almost looked down upon because I was a woman, a young woman doing street evangelism. That could be something that was seen as maybe that's for the men to do, because as a woman, can I be teaching other men? There was a lot of controversy surrounding that. So it was interesting. I was very much like when I was in the church, like, why aren't we doing evangelism? Like, I was very confused by that. And then once I had left, I was realizing like there's less of an emphasis on that and more of an emphasis on family systems. Yeah. And continuing the beliefs and the works and all of that.
My mind's really running wild. I'm sure that there are studies that you know about that talks or looks into the parallels and the differences between the intentions of recruiting versus growing through multiple pregnancies. And then I suppose there are some organizations and groups that have the need for both things, because
of course.
With the FLDS church, as they said in the Keep Sweet Pray and Obey documentary, the young girls were the currency of the realm, but you still needed the money to be going to leadership. So you needed people with paying jobs, but you also needed female children as well.
Yeah. And this group was extremely patriarchal. So yeah, absolutely. It was like, that was women's roles, was to have the kids. And yeah, it's pretty amazing. It
does make sense what you said about the Florida College, though. If it's that elite, and if that's one of the goals that people should strive for as a true non-institutional Church of Christ member, to go and study as your family have done before you. When you think of Ivy League colleges, and when you think of Cambridge and Oxford University, the tutors and the lecturers at these most elitist of further education organizations, they do hire people that have won Pulitzer Prizes and have led the field of research in their area of study.
They are, and they're older and, older men who were very influential in history. So it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Wow.
I mean, you can look up letters that some of them had written, during these times of debates. It's on the internet.
So we've spoken a little bit about you moving from various places and still having your familial attachment to the Churches of Christ and remaining members of the movement despite moving around the world. What would you say your childhood was like? Education is usually a question that I ask people, but for you, it might have looked different. You said that you went to a primary school in the UK, which it probably isn't called a primary school in America. So that must have just been really strange.
Yeah. I mean, I was pretty much in public school my whole life, and I wasn't isolated. I went to a large public high school. It was predominantly Mormon. And so even though it was a public school, I encountered many challenges there being non-Mormon. I had even as far as teachers in the class pull out a Book of Mormon in a public school setting. Wow. Church and state isn't really a thing there in Utah. And so I had struggles with that, even though I was raised in a conservative family and Mormons were conservative. There was a lot of similarities, but there were some pretty major differences. And so that was a hard time, but I had very positive experiences overall in public school. And even though it was challenging being in the minority in this school system, it gave me a lot of opportunity to learn about other cultures, how to handle conflict, from a very early age. My mom probably remembers this story too, but when we first moved to Utah as a fourth grader, it's one of my only memories still from fourth grade, but it was my first day of school and someone came up to me and asked, "Are you Mormon?" And this was my first time hearing Mormon, and I had just absolutely no idea what they were talking about. And I said, "No, I'm not Mormon." And they said, "Well, you are, you just don't know it yet." And then they walked off. This was a fourth grader.
Well, how old are you in the fourth grade?
How old? Oh, I don't know.
Because year 4 in the UK is different to fourth grade.
Yeah. Should I look it up? I'm going to look it up because I feel dumb for not knowing.
Fourth grade. I'll look up how old you are in year 4.
Okay, yeah. I'm so curious. Fourth grade age range. 9 or 10.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So in the UK, year 4, you're 8 to 9 years old.
Okay. So not that much different. And I was actually one of the younger ones in the class, very, very young, because I started school in the UK and they start just a tad younger. So coming to the States, I was always like one of the younger students. But yeah, so I remember that back from when I was 9 or 10, because that was just kind of haunting. I don't know how else to describe it, but it made me realize really quick the environment and Utah culture that I had sort of come into. So while I was in my own sort of community and church setting, it was like conservative community within a broader conservative community. And so while I went to public school and all of that, there was a degree of isolation for sure, even though I was very integrated with society and friends and things.
How did you find your involvement with the church as you grew up? Because you've spoken about going to the college in Florida. Was this something that you were striving for? Were you and you mentioned wanting to evangelize. Were you somebody that really bought into the scripture, that really bought into the faith? Or are you somebody that kind of wanted to follow what your parents' aspirations were for you, but perhaps sprinkled with a few doubt?
I think the simple answer is it's extremely complicated because I think it was many of those things. It was a lot of conflicting, maybe, drivers. So just to sort of yield some perspective, like my grandmother, when I was like a baby, opened up a savings account for me to attend this college later in life.
Okay.
And so it was that important. And I remember my poor mother, I dated a Mormon guy when I was in high school, and there was so much stress around, if Ashlen stays in Utah, she's going to marry a Mormon. And so my parents were really stressed out about that. And so sending me to find a spouse, learn within this environment. They also felt like I missed out on a lot when it came to Church of Christ experiences, because the churches of Christ that I were in, were very small, very sort of isolating in that regard. There wasn't very many young people. My parents were my Bible class teachers very often. And sometimes it would just be me in class. Sometimes it'd be me and another person. But I just didn't really have that sort of cool Church of Christ experience where I had a lot of young people my age. And so I would visit family and cousins in Florida because on my mom's side, they'd be down there. And it was made into like a really fun trip whenever we went. And from a young age, I'd visit my grandmother who was working at the college. So people knew me since I was a young thing visiting the college. And some people were still working there when I attended as an adult. But, visiting the churches of Christ in Florida, in sort of this epicenter, that's where the college is. That's where the teachers are. I mean, there was so many churches of Christ within Tampa, Florida. And these are massive, massive, massive churches of Christ. The one down the street from the college had a couple hundred people. And so when I'd go into these church environments, I would be very stressed, but also like, wow, this is really cool. It was equally daunting. And also like, I kind of had felt like I had missed out on sort of that cool Church of Christ experience. I mean, imagine hundreds of people singing a cappella.
Yeah, I remember Evie talking to us about their experience with the non-institutional churches of Christ, and given the issues around racism and ethnicity was a big focus of my conversation with Evie, but also mostly discussing non-institutional churches of Christ practices that included the a cappella singing, which I thought was really, really interesting. But I imagine it sounds like is it ethereal? Is that the word?
Yeah, it's very I mean it's almost chant like. If you think about that many people singing these hymns, it's very beautiful, and it can really go on and on and on. These singings they really pride themselves on the a cappella stuff. They see they're like, well, there's no way else to do this because this is so great. Definitely visiting these large churches of Christ near the college growing up, I felt a little sad. I felt like I had missed out, but I was also like, this is intense. This is a level of intensity that I maybe didn't grow up with, because I was raised in a smaller church setting. I didn't really hang out with church friends. I didn't really have them. I like hung out with my Mormon friend crew from public school. Like, it was intense. And so I had these mixed feelings, right? I felt the family expectations of going. I also was like, I had just had a breakup in Utah with the Mormon kid and was also like, maybe I just leave Utah. And like, it's kind of that coming of age, like, oh, why not go to school in Florida? And I guess I thought with Florida College, it is a Christian college. That's more so what I saw it as. I didn't really understand all these dynamics, the churches of Christ, the history. I didn't really understand that hardcore environment until I got there. And after being in school there, that's when my eyes were opened up to, okay, like the churches of Christ that I was raised in were conservative, but this is some next level stuff. This is a lot more intense. And when it came to expectations, I was definitely probably seen as a rebel there, because I was quite outspoken. And, racism, Evie talked about that, with you in a former episode. But, that was like that college. And what I didn't find out until years later was the last college in the state of Florida to desegregate.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
And so the college isn't transparent or open about that. They're not really transparent and open about a lot of issues. And that, the topic of racism, that's a whole other conversation, but it definitely opened my eyes to, I thought I grew up within the Church of Christ, but like, man, this is what the Church of Christ is. And I didn't really understand all the dynamics until I got to this really high intense environment, such as the college. I mean, we had chapel every day. We had to take mandatory Bible classes. There was girls only praying, singing nights. We were so busy doing all of these things. And yeah, I hope that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to gain your insight into that inner conflict that you're experiencing, where you're kind of like, I don't know if I like this, but I'm also kind of sad that I didn't get to take part in it,
Yeah,
which is,
totally.
that in itself has got to be difficult. Because if you start to talk yourself out of that decision, you've then got the pressure from your family to follow,
Yeah.
their hopes for you, and the money that's
Yeah.
being put aside from when you were born, which is just,
It was a lot. It was a lot. And so it was complicated, like truly my motivations to go. I also didn't know if I had another option, to be honest. Like that was kind of seen as what I was supposed to do.
Yeah.
So I did it. And I'm very grateful that even though I was in this intense environment, because of my teachers within my program, and I got my bachelor's there in communication. They have a few bachelor's degrees outside of just biblical studies, but I minored in biblical studies actually. But, because the teachers, and one of them was this very wonderful woman who's made a profound impact on my life, but I received an awesome education there, which is very rare to say, going to sort of an intensely structured environment like this, that the education is always great. But I'm very happy that I received a wonderful education there. And I think that my professors and my program made all the difference. And I also did speech and debate. And my partner, actually, who I met there, I did get the husband. I left with the husband. I did what I was supposed to do on so many levels. I left with the husband. No, he was my best friend and still is. And we left together, and our friendship, a lot of that was based in our dissatisfactions for what was going on. And he graduated like maybe 2 years before I did. And so the age difference wasn't that much, but he was one of our speech and debate coaches. And I know this sounds kind of weird, but this is typical small Christian school environments where so he was like my speech and debate coach, and that's how we became friends. And then we started dating later on. And again, I know that sounds weird. This is just how Christian environments go. But he remembered, me doing speech and debate. And he just kind of looked at me because I felt like I was like this submissive, meek housewife in training, He just kind of looked at me and was just like, this isn't you. Like, I can tell that you have like this fire. And he taught me how to be a kick-ass debater. My debate partner and I were going all across the East Coast, taking first place. We even competed internationally in Vienna.
Wow, my goodness.
Doing speech and debate. And we're from this very not known Christian college, just, doing great at speech and debate. And a lot of that is due to my partner Ryan's influence. He really helped me deconstruct, he helped me find my voice, which was really empowering because he could see, me being a young woman in this environment. It's a really hard environment to be a young woman in. And he really just helped me find my voice. And so if it wasn't for some of the professors I had, the education I received, and also doing that extracurricular activity, I don't think I'd be where I am today.
I love that. I mean, yeah. I'd also like to be a fly on the wall where you both have differing opinions on what to have for dinner.
Honestly, you would think it'd be more interesting than it probably is. Our typical conversation goes like, what should we have for dinner? And it's like, I don't know. Does this sound good? Yeah, let's do that. So it's not, he actually told me he would never, even during practice when we were there, he wouldn't actually debate me. When we started dating, that was kind of his rule, was he wouldn't do a formal debate with me. And at first I was mad, and now I can understand why.
So I really like that, though. I really like that he was able to identify, even from growing up in a patriarchal, misogynistic system, that wasn't something that he wanted for you if you didn't want that for yourself, and allowing you to kind of arrive at that place informed with his support is really quite refreshing to hear.
Yeah. I mean, he's
quite progressive, isn't it?
It's very progressive. And he even came from North Alabama. Yeah, in his tiny little small town. And he was quite progressive. I mean, he even did a preacher training for a while. He thought maybe he wanted to be a Church of Christ preacher. And it's not that uncommon for young men in the group. Even though he was a great speaker, I heard him give sermons and such. He realized real quick, this isn't where it's at. And I think we both sort of were rebels together, and it's what drove a lot of our friendship, and we were just, we were like, this isn't for us for a majority of reasons. But yeah, he was my best friend, and I don't know what I would have done without him being there at that college with me, to be such a sounding board. So it's pretty amazing. It was certainly progressive.
That's great. Thank you, Ryan. We appreciate you.
Shout out to Ryan.
What you said about feeling like maybe you didn't know if you had another choice. I was wondering if it ever occurred to you to not practice a religion because you were in Utah as a non-institutional Church of Christ member. So if you were to step away from the Church of Christ, would the natural step have been to adopt Mormonism? If you were to stay in Utah, for example, and not go to Florida, were you a Mormon and you just didn't know it?
Important question. Was I a Mormon?
I mean, Christianity. Did you have a choice? Did you have any other option? That's kind of what I'm thinking.
No, it's a great question, and I'm sorry I'm laughing. I'm thinking of this kid.
Yeah,
you're just Mormon. You don't know it yet. It was just so haunting. It was like, oh my God, like.
Maybe they were right, maybe
I know, maybe they were right. Maybe I was. Maybe it was all a conspiracy. It's a great question. What I've kind of told people was I was all for the Bible. I was all for Christ. What I wasn't all for, even from an early age, was the environment of the Church of Christ. So like, even from an early age, I don't remember ever enjoying going to church.
Okay.
It's not something that I like to do. And, the Church of Christ setting, it just felt intense. I felt anxious. I was already an anxious child. It's not really something that I ever enjoyed. I mean, honestly, I remember crying a lot on the way to church just because I didn't want to go. But without any doubt in my mind, was I for Christianity? And so when I was doing the street evangelism, it wasn't for getting people into the Church of Christ. It was for like promoting Christ, At that time, growing up, would I think that there would be any other option besides Christianity? Absolutely not. I mean, and what I did do in like my real life story was Ryan and I, we got married 3 days after I graduated with my bachelor's. We moved out of Florida back to Utah, back home. That's where my family still was. And so I wanted to be closer to them for a bit. And even though we were mentally out, we were attending a Church of Christ there with my family for several months, maybe almost a year. And I started having panic attacks in the church, and I couldn't keep doing it. And there was a lecture series that was happening at the time on Cine, on that hermeneutical methodology and how to interpret the scriptures, with God's authority. And I just couldn't do it. That was like my breaking point. I was also coming to terms with my sexuality at the time, which made things really complicated for those leaving high control groups. So there was a lot of factors. So we left the Churches of Christ and we immediately went to different Christian churches. So we like church hopped, and that's pretty common. I think there is this common feeling within these settings that maybe we stay and we try to make it better. We try to fix it. That's pretty common. And then you realize real quickly, we're talking about some real systemic issues that just can't be fixed. You're not important enough or special enough to just like fix it when the foundations aren't in an already good place. And so we definitely church hopped. We went to a more, I'd say, Reformed church for a while. We went to more of a Baptist church for a while. We were like chameleons. I just did an interview with Rachel Bernstein for her podcast, and we talk a lot about how I was just a chameleon. I found that I immediately was taking on and pursuing beliefs that they were teaching me. I just was eating it up and thinking that I had found the new truth, so to speak, and it wasn't a good situation. It really confused the hell out of my family. They're like, what? Like, why are you getting baptized again in this other church? You've already been baptized. Like, what's, none of it made sense. And it's because I was trying to explore my faith within these different churches and contexts, but I realized like how quickly I was adopting new things. And this is very common. And so we church hopped for a few years, and then we decided to stop going like completely. I honestly couldn't reconcile, like, me as a queer person feeling comfortable within these spaces. I just couldn't do it. And so we stopped going, and we haven't been in a church now in many, many years. And we feel really happy and comfortable with that. And we don't have to daily figure out what God's will is for us and have to do the mental gymnastics of like, what's the afterlife going to be like? And is my soul in check? We can just live. I just tell people now I'm just vibing out here in Portland because truly I'm just living a happy life. But it took a while, to be honest, Casey. It like took a few different churches, me realizing I was taking on a lot of these different church characteristics, and we just stopped going. And that was very critical for us. It was what needed to happen.
That's really interesting. And thank you for sharing that as well. I know that from the way you're explaining that, it was a confusing and difficult time.
Yeah. And it affected my family. It confused my family. Like, it was one thing for me to leave the church, and that was very difficult. But then it was another thing to like try to convince them. I didn't handle things perfectly at all. I now work with families who are dealing with loved ones in cultic groups, but I certainly didn't communicate with them very well. I was very angry. They didn't understand. They didn't have the same experiences that I did necessarily. And there was a lot of fighting and just sadness, and it affected my whole family system. And that's something that I think makes multi-generational involvement in a group so unique, in that, group involvement just doesn't affect you. It can really affect others within your family.
And Ryan was with you and supportive of you throughout this exploration that you were experiencing and trying to find what it was that you felt was missing or out of place.
I'm very lucky in that Ryan and I's sort of deconstruction happened together. Of course, there was probably smaller issues that we were sort of deconstructing at different times, but we deconstructed a lot of that together and experienced a lot of that together. And I don't know if we would have done all that if we wouldn't have had each other. It was really awesome to have that person, but it was also really difficult because you think about triggering each other all the time. Or if I wasn't, dealing with something with my family, he was dealing with conflict from his family. He was also multi-generation. So you have two multi-generational adults who are trying to navigate this sort of new way of life and perspectives and beliefs, and just having a hard time. So like the bond that Ryan and I have is just really special. And it's just not common that I hear of people who met in a group, left a group, and are still together. I'm acknowledging that is not often the case with most people. And so I'm really grateful that I have that relationship with Ryan.
Each individual is on their own path to recovery. Each person may suggest a different type of therapy that they believe is the correct type of therapy.
Yeah.
So deconstruction is a really interesting thing when you come up against certain things that you may have been trying to figure out. And as you've said, maybe Ryan's at a different point, or he's deconstructing something a bit different. And then you're like, well, if we don't believe this, then maybe we don't believe this. And then the other person's like, well, I still believe that.
Right.
That must have been really interesting.
It was interesting, but we were really like understanding of each other's different aspects of deconstruction. Even our recovery process has looked very different though. Like I was definitely doing therapy, and he's done therapy as well, but even our recovery processes just look so different. But we had experienced Florida College together. We had experienced being grown up, and we had those same pressures together, even though we were across the US. We didn't know each other at all until later in life. Like, we had experienced such a unique setting and unique belief system and unique church environments that our relationship was really brought together out of that experience, that sort of shared experience. And so, but our recovery journeys have looked very different. And I think that's been really good.
I love that. I just love to hear that not every person that makes the really difficult or almost sometimes impossible decision to leave a group isn't left entirely on their own, wondering where do I even begin?
Many of my friends who I had made at the college have since left. And I think it's really interesting, how we can gravitate towards those people in those settings and then find that we all leave for similar or maybe different reasons, but it's been really cool to reconnect with those people. They'll reach out to me and say, hey, I'm rethinking a lot of this. And so it provides some really cool opportunities to kind of reconnect with people. Yeah.
That's so good. And I imagine that their recovery and their deconstruction looks completely different to yours and Ryan's, with some parallels and similarities sprinkled across all of that. So I think that's just important to recognize in reflection on our earlier conversation around various survivor communities and the correct way forward, because it's not cookie cutter, is it?
Oh my goodness, no.
So where did life take you after you left? And I mean, do you consider yourself a person of faith now? It's just that you choose not to go to church. And how was it that you moved into the area of cultic education and recovery?
Yeah. To answer your first question, no, I actually don't consider myself a person of faith. At this time in my life, at least, I'm just enjoying being able to focus on things that have nothing to do with faith, actually, because, my whole life that was like the focus. And so being able to kind of breathe and not have to focus solely on that, it has been really healing for me. How I ended up in this field is out in Utah, after leaving the Church of Christ, that was a very difficult thing. And I wanted to help particularly other women who had experienced some sort of spiritually abusive environment or faith transition. I knew that's what I wanted to sort of work with, that population. Out in Utah, I found a nonprofit that was working with those who had left polygamous groups all across the West. And what was so interesting was I started volunteering and they heard my story and they saw how I interacted with these women, like fresh out of polygamy. And they realized, like, wow, I'm just like connecting and hitting it off. I didn't leave anything like a polygamous group. But even when it came to theological pressures, we were connecting on so many levels of similarity, And so we were just kind of able to laugh at certain things. And we almost had these little jokes that only we understood or made sense. And so I was actually hired as a case manager for this nonprofit because they could see just how easy it was for me to be able to connect. And it was a really high intensity job. To not sugarcoat it, I was harassed. Group members tried to follow me home. They tried to set me up and intimidate me. I had to take self-defense classes. I had an overnight bag packed in my home that Ryan and I could grab if we needed to get out of there.
Oh my goodness. So serious cases of gang stalking.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we experienced some really, really intense harassment. And it was, I dealt with constituents from many different polygamous groups. There's so many breakoffs. Of polygamous groups and things, especially after Warren Jeffs went to prison. We're dealing with more and more breakoffs. But the Kingston Clan is known as the Mafia of the West. They are a polygamous group, and maybe you've heard of them, Casey. They're pretty well known. They're also called the Order. The Kingston group is one of the most dangerous groups to, help women who had left from. I mean, women leaving the Kingstons, they always had tracking devices under their cars. We would immediately look for that. So we were basically dealing with a gang that owned a lot of the munitions stores within the Salt Lake Valley. They had businesses. We were working within, a community that had these members. The apartment complex that I lived in at the time, the street next to it, I thought was really suspicious. There was military vehicles on the property. There was these big gates. I was like, what is going on? And then I realized I was walking through the neighborhood. This is a Kingston neighborhood. I mean, just existing within the normal Salt Lake Valley, you have these different polygamous sects, and some are more harassing than others. Some like to go live in the middle of the desert, and that's fine. But the Kingstons are pretty integrated within the Salt Lake Valley. They tried to intimidate me and the other person who I was with by blocking the entrance to the neighborhood. I mean, I was just so well known because I was one of 2 case managers in the state of Utah working with this population. And they would get really pissed off when their wives would try to flee with their children. I mean, they would. And so they knew my face, and It was a very difficult environment to work within, but I tell you what, I loved working with the moms and the children, and there was just nothing more valuable. I still think it's some of the most valuable work that I've ever done. I loved working with the teenage boys who were always in trouble, the lost boys, as they were kind of known, who were always in trouble, and I worked a lot with parents who were still in the FLDS, who were maybe looking to give power of attorney so that their kid can basically be in like a foster environment in a non-polygamous household. And I'd go meet with the family and I'd help work out conflict and, take the teenager out for lunch and figure out what was going on and what they were sort of struggling with. And I absolutely loved that work. Absolutely loved that work. And it was through that work that I came across the International Cultic Studies Association. They had their first, well, it wasn't their first, but it was my first conference, was the Philadelphia 2019 annual conference. And I put in a call for papers. I was in my early 20s and I spoke there on my work with polygamists, and I didn't know anybody or anything about ICSA. I was like terrified. And I went and spoke and realized when I was there at a conference, like, oh shit, I actually have a lot of stuff I haven't addressed with my own story.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
And so I was feeling very overwhelmed, not only because I had to speak and I was pretty comfortable with public speaking, but I remember attending a born or raised workshop, just like I didn't know that this was a thing. I didn't know that we sort of had these similar issues that we were trying to recover from. And so it was through that work that really opened me up to so many gaps within my own recovery, right? Like it was pretty wild. In hindsight, I wish that I was in, so much of this work with polygamous families was incredibly healing. And then there was aspects that were really traumatizing, probably because I hadn't properly addressed my own recovery. I was just pouring so much into helping other people.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, that would have been good to know. So I stayed in touch with ICSA. And then shortly after that conference, a job position opened up as assistant to the executive director, and I applied and I got the job. So I actually moved to Florida for 5 months. We put all our stuff in storage in Utah, moved to Florida for 5 months. We saw it as a really big opportunity, and I did training with the director in Florida. And moving to Florida was a very stressful event because Florida held so many memories and things there, but we did it. And after that, training and all of those things, fast forward 3 years, 4 years later, I've settled here in Portland, Oregon, and we absolutely love Portland. We didn't quite want to go back to Utah after everything, the trauma, I was looking to live somewhere where like my only population wasn't from like Mormon origins, if that makes sense.
I was going to ask what the kind of main religious affiliation is in Portland, or because it's my understanding that not only does it have more of a forgiving climate in comparison to places like Utah and Florida, but it also is, I don't know if progressive is the right word, but inclusive of many different people from many different walks of life. It's seen as one of those.
Yeah, Portland is actually one of the most liberal cities within the US. It is truly, probably here more than anywhere else, we've sort of been on the forefront of like more socialist adaptations within like our own local government structure, more European models that we've tried to take on. It is a very, honestly, I really was seeking that. After growing up in such a conservative setting, I was like, let's move somewhere that's like so unhinged compared to what we grew up with. And we did.
Crazy.
And we've loved it. I mean, it's truly, people say that Portland is weird. The saying here is keep Portland weird. It is the weirdest place I've ever lived, but it is endless amounts of entertainment. I love the people. I love the food. I love the climate. It's beautiful here. And it's just been a wonderful place to sort of deconstruct a lot. It's been a really healing place for me. And I just didn't want to move back to Utah. Like I was just kind of done with these really conservative cities, environments. In Portland, there's not a predominant religious. In fact, I'd say most people here aren't religious.
So if you were to go through the public school system again in Portland, it wouldn't be that every child in the class had some Christian affiliation.
No, not at all.
Wow, that's so interesting, isn't it? To
Yeah.
think of the how different that is in comparison to Utah in terms of really blurred lines between church and state, and how actually it's like a theocratic state, isn't
Yeah.
it?
And we, of course, Portland has a bunch of issues. I mean, just like any other city, we're dealing with a very sad homelessness crisis, drug crisis, gun violence has gone up. It's a lot of the issues, though, that every major city is dealing with in the US. But of course, there's corruption here. There's still issues here, even at a local level. But man, I've just really enjoyed being in a culture. You know, I feel like a lot of the outcasts from different places have ended up in Portland, you know, and like it's easy to kind of go to a coffee shop and meet different people who were sort of outcasts from different states as well, either because they weren't a part of the religious majority or for other reasons or for being gay. You know, we have a huge LGBTQ population here, which is wonderful. So I've just really enjoyed. I think that geography can make a huge difference in healing from these settings. Somebody messaged me, they're like, I don't know, like, should I just move? And I was like, I don't know, you got to make your own decisions. But like, for me, it was really helpful to like move somewhere that allowed me to be more myself, a little bit more comfortable.
That's so great to hear. That really is like a refreshing take on an individual's recovery, especially when you consider that you were moving to unfamiliar territory away from your family. I mean,
Yeah.
Ryan's your family now.
Yeah.
When you get older and you're like, when you get into a serious relationship, you're like, oh, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
You're my family.
Right.
So you end up working for the International Cultic Studies Association. Who's the executive director at that time?
It was Michael Angoni, and Michael is now retired. They're in the process of hiring a director, like at this point in time. But yeah, I was there for 3 years. 3 years I was there. And when I first started at ICSA, Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly with Intervention 101, Cult News 101. You know, I know Pat's been interviewed on your show.
Cult Recovery 101.
Yes, yes. all the spin-offs of that. You know, at the first conference that I attended in Manchester, that I ran in Manchester, Michael couldn't come. He was sick. And so he told Pat, he said, can you get to know Ashlen and kind of show her the ropes and like help introduce her to these main people in the field and help her kind of navigate. You know, I was like you, Casey, in that I didn't understand this field can be very competitive, either for funding or for otherwise. It can be, there's a lot of personalities, sometimes egos that you kind of have to figure out. And at that conference, you know, I wouldn't stop. I'd be working all day running the table for registration and things. And Pat and Joe made sure that I was fed. It was a very motherly, like they would text me, and I was doing a lot with Mike Cropfield at the time. And they said, you know, dinner's ready at 10 p.m. at our Airbnb. So we would go eat dinner and drink wine until late. And so from the beginning, I was honestly kind of adopted by Pat and Joe, is what I tell people. And I'm just so grateful. I mean, they are some of my dearest friends in my life that I've ever made. And a lot of those relationships that I've met through ICSA have been really beneficial in that way. You know, I have visited them every year in Philly. They live in South Philly, and I've run conferences with them in Philly, smaller, like 2-day events and things. I was visiting, I think it was my first visit to Philly after the Manchester conference. We went to, believe it was the Navy Yard out in Philadelphia. It was kind of cool. They had like restaurants and things. And Joe was telling me a little bit about, he was telling me what he could tell me about a current case he was working on. And I just looked at Joe and I said, I really want to do the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you know, I feel like you have some really unique expertise to be doing this work. I mean, I've experienced like harassment from cults, right? I've experienced all kinds of things. And he said, I really feel like you could do this work. And so we kind of kept that conversation open. We got to know each other more. And about a year ago, even when I was with ICSA, I was getting brought onto cases for the first time with Pat and Joe. And for those of you who are listening who may not know, family members contact Pat and Joe if they have a loved one or a child in a cultic group. And we go through this whole psychoeducational process with them and see what can be done and just help support them in what they need in their journeys. And I was brought in to do research and all kinds of things in the beginning. And now I've been doing full-scale assessments with them and interview with family members, especially after completing my master's degree in the psychology of coercive control. I felt more ready to take on more cases from the beginning. So once I had left ICSA, which wasn't that long ago, it's been within, I'd say maybe 3 months now, I started my own LLC, and it's called People Leave Cults, which is a really groovy name, I know. I'm doing the work that they have mentored me to do. I still have supervision from them. They've done cases with families for 30 plus years. We work on cases together still. I bring in a team. I would select a mental health professional depending on the case. So we work as a team, and I have just absolutely loved the work that I do. And it's been just so wonderful to have. It wouldn't have been possible without their mentorship. So the finishing my master's has kind of helped open up that door. I felt like I was more sort of credentialed in that way, like ready to go with doing my own LLC after that.
That's amazing. I just love hearing that. That's like inspiring for anybody working in the space of cult education and recovery, I think, to just hear not only how you received support from others who are so experienced in the field itself, but also how passionate and motivated, almost like you found your own slice of something that wasn't predetermined at your birth.
Right. Part of my work is just continuing Pat and Joe's legacy and being the next generation of trauma-informed exit workers within the field. And there's a whole history about all the awful, horrible things associated with deprogramming. And Pat and Joe gave a great talk on where we are now in our approaches with families. It's an informed consent approach. I really wanted to sort of help preserve their work and keep that work going, because I think that their model and their approach is a very respectful, ethical one. And that was really important to me to keep that going. Yeah.
Well, that's definitely something to note, isn't it? Despite the length of time that Pat and Joe have been working in the field, where perhaps deprogramming was a method that was used with those called upon by family members to help them rescue a loved one from a cultic environment, we've moved into that space of mediation now. So
it's more mediation than anything. I mean, interventions are pretty rare at this point in history. I have a link on my site, peopleleavecults.com, that talks about the storied history of cult intervention from deprogramming to where we are now. And it's very interesting. Very interesting stuff.
Your research topic within your master's, after having our conversation today, makes a bit more sense now why you specifically chose that as your research topic. So I wonder if you could just tell people what I'm already privy to, which is how you heard about the course, how you accessed the course, what your experience was like, just that kind of whole picture around your time on the master's course.
Sure. Well, I had known Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall, the program leads, through my work with ICSA. I mean, Rod is on the board. Linda was chair of the mental health committee for ICSA. And we had an opportunity to really connect in Manchester when I was running an ICSA conference there. And I talked with them about the program. When the program was only a year old, I applied, and I actually wanted to go in person. This was several years ago. But the UK visa requirements were just so intensely difficult, even for a student visa. And because I was married, we would have had to have had like double in our savings account to go. It was unreal. So that couldn't happen. And the program was only in person at the time. So I was devastated. I waited, and then the COVID pandemic happened a few years later. And I decided what better time, since I'm stuck in my house, I decided to not only work full time with ICSA, but to go to school full time. I don't know why I wanted to just, cause pain and suffering for myself, but I did. And it was the first time that the program went online, was because of the pandemic. And so through waiting it out, it was actually a great time to do it. And so I did it. And my research study the title of it was The Relationship Between Reproductive Coercion, Psychologically Abusive Environments, and the Extent of Group Identity in a sample of those who've left cultic groups. So it was the first quantitative exploratory study on a sample of like basically those who have been in cults who experience reproductive coercion. But what was really interesting is, when it comes to reproductive coercion, most studies that have been done on reproductive coercion have been done in clinical hospital settings, women's healthcare settings, things like that. They more so focus on the partner as being the source, the intimate partner as being the source of control or coercion. And so my research really filled a gap because within cults, the theology could be the source of coercion. The leader it could still be the intimate partner, but not so much within a cultic system. It could also be extended family systems within the cultic environment. So what I was looking at was what was the source of reproductive control within those who'd experience RC and cults. RC is reproductive coercion in cults. And so my research really fulfilled that research gap. I just did a big presentation on it, actually, and I have the recording on all my research and findings, but it was really fascinating, really exciting. Let's see, it was about half. I think it was like actually half of my participants were born or raised. I could be misquoting that, but all this to say was a huge majority of participants were born or raised. And that was really exciting for me to see, was that representation of those who had been born or raised in groups being involved in this study. That was really exciting. I had over 40 different cultic groups that were represented in the study.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
There was only 99 participants, which is still great. I only had my survey live for 2 weeks, if that. But within the 99, there was like 40 different groups.
It was wild.
It was wild.
I thought you were going to say that you had a few hundred participants to cover that many different groups. Oh my goodness. Ashlen, that's huge.
It was so cool. And so I'm hoping to get my findings published. That's kind of my next big step. But it was very exciting. It was very exciting. And it was a quantitative study, which scared me to death. I also did a content analysis of a reproductive autonomy scale that I used as a measure in my study. And as the researcher, I adapted the reproductive autonomy scale to fit the participants' needs to account for different variables and sources of control within a cultic setting. I can link to you, and I'm happy to give it to you, Casey. My presentation, I've just recorded a whole thing on it.
Yes,
and the
that
result
would be
findings.
amazing. Yes.
So I'm happy to provide that link if you wanted to provide it on the info for this podcast.
Yeah, we'll put it in the episode description. I think people would be really interested to have a look at that. And do you feel like, firstly, how would you define reproductive coercion? And secondly, how are you thinking and feeling about the religious and political climate in the country you live in currently when you are thinking about reproductive coercion?
So there's two different domains of reproductive coercion as classified in the research literature. The first domain is the interpersonal level, and that makes sense, right? Typically from an intimate partner, it can be a means of control. But then there's also the structural level, which has to do with many different variables. That could be religious, that could be government regulation. That could account for many different variables that can control reproductive outcomes and health. So I'm very concerned about what's going on right now in this country. It's so scary. It's also not totally surprising, but it doesn't make it any more, comfortable. It's really frightening what's going on. And so if I can sort of give back to the cult survivor community by helping educate them as to here's what reproductive control can look like and manifest like, and help them feel seen in their experiences, that's a big win for me at the end of the day. Reproductive coercion, I believe, is defined in the study, was a definition provided by Grace and Anderson, researchers on the topic, back in like 2018. And it's known as any behavior that interferes with the outcomes of pregnancy or reproductive health and autonomy. And I'm not quoting that exactly word for word, but I'm kind of summarizing. And that can look like controlling the outcomes of pregnancy, interference with birth control, like birth control sabotage, or just interfering with sexual health rights at all. So
this is crazy though, because if you look at America from the definition that you've just given, it's almost like the entire country
is experiencing reproductive control. And it really, I mean, it on the structural domain, it can be viewed as that for sure.
Wow. Oh my goodness. And you've lived in what is almost a theocratic state. You could
Yeah.
argue from law enforcement's involvement in allowing plural marriages to exist, for not intervening in the way that they should, even though there are laws around polygamy and the protection of children in those environments. I can see why you would say that it's terrifying to consider that America as a country at some point could become a Christian nation.
Totally. I think
we're in
that route.
Some people think that I'm kind of leaning into conspiracy theories when I say that, or I'm only interested in left-wing media. But there are indicators that we can look at that, even with, is it Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Oh yeah.
When
Unhinged.
she talks about giving people biblical literacy tests to see if they can remain as American citizens.
It's so sad. It's absolutely wild. It's so sad. I don't think that makes you any sort of conspiracy theorist. The indications are pretty clear that this country is dangerously heading that direction. And, even throughout my research and presenting on reproductive coercion, I had people reach out to me who said, I didn't know that I experienced this in my group until I watched your presentation. That was really impactful. I also felt horrible, because that could be a really tough thing to face and recover from. But it was quite inspiring when people told me that, because, sometimes we don't even realize our experiences, and to kind of put a term to it and a definition to it and examples to it. There's just been no study that looks at how does this manifest in a cultic environment, because cults in the research are considered probably hard to reach or hidden populations. And so I had the opportunity, because of social media and different support groups and my work with ICSA, to get the word out for participants for this study. So I'm really grateful for that.
It just makes so much sense now, the research topic that you landed on in the end after our conversation today. Just a quick question that I have. When you speak about reproductive coercion, are you looking at the other side of it as well, in terms of people that fall pregnant and wish to pursue that pregnancy and then don't have the opportunity because of coercion on the flip side of things, like women who are forced to terminate pregnancies against their will? And I hate just the terminology around abortions. It's all really uncomfortable language to use, I think. So for anybody that is listening, I do apologize.
Yeah, to being forced. Yes, forced abortion is considered reproductive coercion as well. And so there's sort of these two extremes, right? Like you just mentioned, and I'm glad you brought this up. There's the extreme of continuing to have children and that pressure to have children, like within the polygamous family systems, that could be the case because, in order to get to the higher degree of heaven, like practicing polygamy and having children, it's very important. But then on the flip side, Scientology, for example, has had a history of forced abortions. Both instances are categorized as reproductive coercion because ultimately it's interfering with a woman's preferences to give birth or to not give birth. It's an interference with people's choices. And I said woman, I shouldn't have. It's inclusive to all genders. Trans individuals can experience pregnant people. Thank you. And that's something that I'm continuing to correct my language on as well. For the study, I framed it for participants. I said, if you identified as female during your time in a cultic setting, you were eligible to participate. Because, someone may have identified as female within a cult and then transitioned or has since identified as non-binary afterward. And what's really cool is I had people who had transitioned who were able to participate in the study. And we were able to have more representation of marginalized voices because when they were in the cult, they identified as female, they had this expectation. And so why shouldn't their voices be a part of the study as well? And I did receive a lot of pushback on that from certain people within the field. They're like, this is just a woman's issue and this is just these things. And I'm like, absolutely not. Like inclusive language and within the research is really important. And we're accounting for these perspectives that have never been seen in the research.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you mentioned that this was the first quantitative research of its type that had been conducted, but then also within that you're still reaching other community groups
absolutely
inside of that. So that's
yeah
amazing. And also, it's not just a woman's issue, because we've had multiple people come on the show and say, my mum was forced to continue giving birth repeatedly, even though she was told by doctors that she would die if she carried on having children.
right
So it's not just the women that are affected, it's everybody.
absolutely
It's the children,
it's everybody.
they say, oh, it's God's will for you to keep having children, but what about the children that already,
and their mother has died because they were kept forcing,
I mean,
it's horrible.
We
It's
could just talk all day about the type of all the individuals that are impacted by all areas of reproductive coercion. And I'm sure that there were times when you were doing your research where you're like, oh, we could include this and this and this and this, but at what you have to kind of like, oh, that must be so difficult.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
you did graduate from Salford University
with distinction, which was really exciting, because to get distinction, while working full time, I was just so excited. I was so happy.
When we spoke, and it was the same when I spoke with Chris Shelton about his experiences as well, neither of you had your results.
We hadn't had our grades. Yeah. It was many, many months until we had our results. And so, I remember being on a group chat with different students and things, and everyone's panicking because no one has had the results. And it was months, but yes, I received my, I'm looking at it right now, my diploma.
Congratulations, Ashlen. That's amazing.
Thank you.
And then that kind of gave you, do you think it gave you the confidence to start your LLC? Because it sounds like you had the experience and the knowledge to do it.
It was interesting because when I entered the program, it was kind of a reversal in that I had this unique experience in the field already. I had been working with populations. I worked at an organization that was already in the cult recovery field. I've worked with numerous organizations within the cult recovery space. So I had a very unique, I've worked with trafficking victims. I already had all this like real life experience. And so what the program provided me with was an academic framework and understanding to concepts that I already understood, but help provide a further, framework and definitional understanding to that. And so I felt like getting my master's was sort of the icing on the cake, and my confidence in being able to have the expertise and knowledge to like start my LLC.
Amazing. And I can hear Hamilton barking in the
Sorry.
background. No, it's okay. I'm just wondering, because of his visual impairment, like when he barks, is it because he needs help?
No, it's actually, he is a very vocal dog. He'll like come and talk to me all the time. He doesn't typically just bark at me, but he will actually talk. Kind of sounds like Chewbacca from Star Wars a little bit. He will it's like a husky. He loves to talk because he can't see. He reminds me that he's there, and it's like, I know you're there. It's okay. Like, I'm here, I haven't gone anywhere. But he barks when he hears our Amazon Alexa just went off because we had a package delivery. So when Alexa goes off, he knows that something's awry.
Oh,
he
Hamilton.
I know. Hamilton.
So you graduated with distinction. You launched your LLC recently in the last few months.
Yeah.
peopleleavecult.com. That's where people can find you.
Yes.
And what sort of things do you offer within the LLC?
Yeah, so it's intervention work, mediation work. I work with families. It's the same sort of model that's informed my approach that Pat and Joe do. So it's a team approach in that if someone were to fill out my intake form, they're a family member in crisis or something, I offer, a free 30-minute consultation, and I bring in, I want to have that supervision for just as long as I can get it. And so I'll bring in someone like Pat or Joe to work with me on a case. And then, of course, bring in a mental health professional who may have certain expertise or background to be able to like help address this case specifically. I really love that it's a team approach. I honestly don't feel like it should just be one person telling the family, or giving this kind of advice or suggestions. That could be really risky. And so I love that it's an all-encompassing, informed. We are offering a team approach to a really complex issue. And so there's roles that I play that throughout mediation and intervention that the therapist cannot play because of licensing issues. And there are roles that the therapist plays because they are licensed that I cannot play. And so we have these very distinctive roles and abilities. And it's so cool to see, us work within our parameters and come together to create an informed approach for the family.
That sounds so amazing.
Yeah, so there's a lot of accountability even between team members, because we have people. What's cool with what I've been able to offer is, my perspective on reproductive related issues. I've had a few cases involving that, and my research has been super applicable. So that's been exciting. Even my experience with LGBTQ issues has been helpful for families. My age, even me identifying as, a woman within this arena, sometimes that can be really helpful for families. It's just interesting to see who they choose to connect with the most on the team, who they reach out the most to and who they find they can speak to.
As someone born and raised as well, do you find that adds a different dynamic as well?
I think absolutely. And I think it's helpful for them to see, like, these are some of the things that I went through and look what I'm doing now. Like, it's not hopeless for your loved one. And I do a lot of the psychoeducation with them, just working through, what they're experiencing and why, and a lot of destigmatizing of family members who get involved in these groups. It's easy for the family to become really angry at them, and that's super normal and natural to feel those feelings. So it's working with the family to kind of understand maybe how they ended up there and what the group maybe offers them. Oh,
I love that, Ashlen. It sounds like amazing work.
Yes,
it sounds
I love
so
it.
fulfilling, and it sounds like you're really learning at the same time as well.
Yes.
My worst fear in life is like stagnating in a job where you switch off and you don't even have to think about what you're doing. I just want to be learning all of the time, and it sounds like you kind of have that perfect balance between your own recovery, your own education, helping others, and continuing on, as you said, the legacy that other experts in the forefront of cult mediation are leaving behind, because one day they're going to want to retire, and I bet they feel comfortable knowing that Pat and Joe, sorry, I should not just keep saying they, I'm sure that Pat and Joe feel comfortable in the knowledge that there will be other people in the field to help these families once they do decide to retire.
I've adopted so much of their models and, their mentorship and what they've taught me. And yet they feel super comfortable with me adding my own, experiences and flair and differences in the process to it, which is really cool. It's a very collaborative setting, to work within. And we really just have our own strengths when it comes to this sort of work and meeting with families. And I certainly have some really unique qualifications in that my life experiences have been very interesting and have led me here. So I've been really grateful lately for that.
I know that you probably can't or wouldn't speak about specific cases, but I just interestingly, for me, is there a specific type of group that families come forward with? In this age, I'm wondering if there's a specific group more so than others that families come to you with around losing their loved ones to.
Well, I can speak in that I've heard Pat and Joe talk with other people about, so I could talk about this, but the influx of QAnon cases about a year ago, maybe even 2 years ago now, but I mean, they were receiving applications after of intake forms that family members would fill out when QAnon was at its height. That was a pretty wild moment, an instance of, we were seeing predominantly and that was before I was even really working with them, but that was a pretty wild time of families, losing loved ones to QAnon. It was a time. And the work that I've done, honestly, very diverse cases, very diverse situations. Since I've been doing work with them, there has not been one particular group like the QAnon influx was a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Which was kind of the answer that I was fishing for, I suppose. But that leads us to the end of our discussion.
Yes.
PeopleLeaveCults.com was the last point on my checklist.
Yay.
I think you've given us some really incredible insight into not only the history of the Churches of Christ, but the 1950 split between the institutional and the anti or non-institutional Churches of Christ, your personal experiences in the movement, and your subsequent deconstruction and journey through further education and now the incredible work that you're doing around cult intervention, recovery and education, putting out that research and resources for individuals is amazing. I will absolutely put a link in the episode description to that video that you've done. I think there would be a lot of people listening that would be interested in that. And if anybody is looking for a 30-minute free consultation or perhaps even just signposting
even if you want to connect. Yeah. Even if you want to connect, I'm here.
peopleleavecult.com, or I do have Ashlen's email address as well, so we can work that out. I mean, do you work mostly with American cases, or if you were approached by...
We're open to international as well. There was a case in India that came up semi-recently, and it was kind of up in the air as to whether or not I'd end up going to India. So we're very open to working anywhere.
That's amazing. I suppose if you're bringing other professionals on board, then there is scope to work internationally, because you have so many contacts that can point you towards safe and sensitive professionals in the field. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ashlen, MSc. I've really appreciated having this conversation with you today.
Oh, Casey, thank you for your time. I was looking forward to today, and I love the work that you do. I think it's really important, and honestly, just so grateful you even wanted to talk with me. There's so many more interesting people.
No, I wanted to talk for ages, and I thought it was so funny because Jen Kiaba put us in touch and we had our chat.
Yeah.
And then I started getting the newsletters from Cult News 101 every morning. And then, you'd scroll down to the bottom, and then I was like, there's a new name on this newsletter. So when I spoke with Pat, I was like, Pat, there's a new name on your newsletter. And he's like, yes, well, we've recently brought in someone a bit younger. So that was really interesting as well. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Ashlen, for sitting and chatting with me today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
You as well. Thank you, Casey.
Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.